and welcome to the Wordful Woman podcast. I'm Christina, your host, and my guests are people who operate at the intersection of science and spirituality. It is my great pleasure today to speak with Craig Weiler. Welcome to the show, Craig.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to be on your show, Christina.
It's a great honor to have you on my show. For our listeners, Craig Weiler is the science editor for Paranormal Daily News. He is a parapsychology journalist, author, and blogger. Craig covers controversies in parapsychology and occasionally other topics, as well as interesting studies, various researchers and projects, and the occasional topical subject related to parapsychology. To listeners unfamiliar with parapsychology, this is the scientific exploration of what appear to be paranormal phenomena, such as telepathy, precognition, telekinesis, and remote viewing. Craig Weiler is also the author of Psi Wars, TED, Wikipedia, and the Battle for the Internet, where he covers issues around censorship and dogma in science. Today, Craig is joining us to discuss one particular aspect of this censorship and dogma, sexism in science, more specifically, the presence of sexism in skeptical communities. I'm using air quotes, as Craig will share more about how this is not actually skepticism. A bit of context on how this episode came to be for our listeners. Craig and I met via a parapsychology conference we were both attending. I reached out to him after he spoke up twice during the conference against sexism in science, and he kindly agreed to come on the show to share his insights. Before we go into the questions that I have for Craig, we found it important that we explicitly acknowledge our limitations. Craig is a white man from the US, and while he does not have lived experience as a woman, he does have a good understanding of the male side of misogyny, and his expertise allows him a unique point of view that I believe is important to hear. As for myself, I'm a white European woman who has lived experience of sexism, so I have a very good understanding of how it can manifest and inflict damage in both obvious and subtle ways. But naturally, my experiences and perspectives won't be representative for all women. Both Craig and I believe it's critically important to open up discussions about sexism in science, even if, or rather, especially when they're inconvenient or uncomfortable. Craig, I would like to invite you to start us off by sharing how you came to investigate scientific censorship and dogma.
Thanks, Christina. So the way this started for me was I've loved writing. So I began blogging when that became available, somewhere around 2008, where I found a website to blog for, and I started out writing about politics like everybody else. Because that's a subject that a lot of people are interested in, myself included. And then I kind of drifted over into writing about psychic stuff. And this is when I ran into online skeptics for the first time. That was a surprise to me because I was writing a blog on a popular site about psychic ability, and I would get like 50 comments that were incredibly negative, just really, really angry type, you're full of it, type stuff. I was like, what? Huh? And then they said, well, there's no evidence for psychic ability, yada, yada, yada. James Randi's $1 million prize, yada, yada. So I thought, I'll investigate that. For those of you who don't know, James Randi was a magician who managed to start a $1 million prize for anybody who could prove that they had psychic abilities according to a test which he completely and totally controlled. Nobody ever passed his test. Unlike the skeptics, I read information that was critical of Randi's $1 million prize. And when I started looking into it, I discovered that this is really not a test so much as a PR stunt, and that it wasn't really honest. And other people had written about this as well, critics, who had pointed out the flaws in his particular test. And this was quite different from the comments I was getting, because apparently these people who were supposedly skeptics had not done any bit of research about it at all, other than knowing that this challenge existed. So I was kind of flabbergasted. It's like these people are proposing that they're the rational ones, and they haven't done a single bit of research on this. This is weird. And that was really what began my journey, was what on earth is going on with these people, and why are they so disagreeable about a subject which they obviously know very little about? And so that was how it started.
It's very interesting what you talk about, because on the one hand, at least some of the people that you describe, they describe themselves as skeptics, but what you described there is not really skepticism, is it? Could you expand a bit about that? Because I think that's a point of confusion, really. For example, I would, as our listeners as well, identify as skeptical. I don't take things at face value. I maintain healthy levels of doubt. I think that's a good thing. I ask questions. I look for evidence to back up claims. But it really doesn't sound like that's the kind of opposition you are encountering there. So what's going on?
That's a really interesting question. And it took me a very long time to sort it out. It ended up being a major point in my book. It's a little bit complicated. And so first of all, you're right in that this is not actual skepticism. These people that claim to be skeptics, and that's how they define themselves. They take the label skeptic, and that's a self-identifying label that they put on themselves as a skeptic. They believe that they are rational, and that their thought processes are very logical, and that other people are crazy and full of fantasy and not thinking clearly. So you're dealing with a belief system here, not really reality. You know, if you look around and you see most people during regular life, what you'll see is that people behave in a relatively rational manner, and that they'll have some beliefs here or there which are possibly a little bit out there, but they have reasons for it, probably based upon personal experience. And then you have people on the edges that are a little wild. But what I began to find was that you have people who are committing one type of error, which is they believe something that isn't actually there. But then you have people that commit the other type of error, which is not believing something that is there. The skeptics tend towards the latter type of error. When I say skeptics, I mean these self-defined skeptics who have some of these beliefs. I dug deeper into this, and one of the things that you discover when you talk to these people is that they see everything in a very, very black and white way. In other words, all of their sources and all of their thoughts are 100% correct, and they simply and completely reject everything else. Very, very black and white. It's an interesting thing to see, because there's a complete level of disrespect for any opposition to what they believe. Now, if you think this sounds like fundamentalist Christians and all the other people who, all the other beliefs where people are fundamentalists, that was my take on it too. That this looked to me to be a form of fundamentalism. And there's a name for it, scientism, which is basically when somebody takes science as the ultimate form of reality and rejects everything that doesn't fit into their view of science. So they were displaying fundamentalism, zealotry, a need to push their point of view and to convince other people that they were right. This is an interesting aspect of them, because it reframes them not as rational people, but rather as the type of fundamentalist that is simply a zealot. Now, I know I've used this word a couple of times, but what they do is more public relations than looking into science. The way I fashion it is, the way I describe this mostly is that, one, they're all atheists, all of them. These self-described skeptics are all atheists, which should tell you one thing. It's like they're all sharing this atheistic belief system. And then if you divide it up into different forms of atheism, you find that they are anti-theist. Anti-theist is a form of atheism that is, how do I describe this? It's a form of atheism that attacks religion. So they see religion as infantile and full of magical thinking, and they'll ridicule those aspects of religion. That's just part of their belief system. So you have the anti-theists, and then if you narrow that down a bit, then you get the skeptics. So you have anti-theism and scientism combined, and they come across to me as the crazy fringe of atheism.
I think it's important also to distinguish, because I know a lot of atheists who are very rational people. They're evidence-based, like they don't have that, what sounds like that emotional component, that over-attachment to that identity. Like it almost sounds like what you're describing is an over-attachment to being in one way, or to have a view of the world in one way. Is that it? Is that what goes on there? Is there something else behind this fundamentalism, as you describe it?
They are enormously attached to a very, very particular worldview. It is very materialistic. So they only believe in what they can see and and particular sciences that conform to this particular view. And they are hostile to everything else. So, for example, they're hostile to parapsychology. They are hostile to homeopathy. They are hostile to chiropractors. They are hostile to Santa Claus. They are hostile to the Easter Bunny. They are hostile to acupuncture, naturopathy, pretty much any holistic medicine. And you can derive from this a belief in, you could derive from this that their worldview is very narrow. And you can see this from the beliefs that they have, that scientism is their worldview, and that they're not entertaining an idea of anything that might be beyond that.
So in that sense, it's not really the pursuit of truth. It's rather the pursuit of maintaining a certain truth, regardless of whether it actually reflects objective reality or not. Is that correct?
It's defending a belief, is how I would frame that.
You and I connected over what you described as, really an issue with sexism in this community of what I would call pseudo-skeptics that you're describing. How do you think, first of all, can you describe the issue a little bit for our listeners? So what is going on there exactly? What kind of cases have you encountered or heard about?
Well, first of all, if you've ever encountered a skeptic, you know that they're kind of angry people. Just in general, they're insulting and condescending, which is an indication of like what's going on in their head. Is they're just not happy people, and a lot of them are it's a predominantly male community, mostly skewering younger. And you'll see with the anger and with the limited views and stuff, they have a lot of authoritarian traits. And authoritarian is generally, bootlick your superior and punish your inferiors, right? That's kind of an authoritarian trait. And there's a tendency among these skeptics, because they already have this mindset of doing that with women. And you can see the you can see it in the occasional drama that unfolds in skeptical communities, because the women who are in those communities will speak up about it, and then you'll get a lot of blogs and things going on about various mistreatment of women, sometimes at the hands of some very prominent skeptics.
So we're talking about pretty overt types of sexism in this community, not just well, just being, big air quotes, because that is an issue in and of itself, subtle forms of sexism. But it sounds like what you are describing and what I was reading in preparation for this interview and from your book as well are anything from being sexually harassed at a conference to even allegations of rape. So it sounds like a very, very serious problem to be aware of and to address. Have you ever witnessed anything like that personally? You don't have to give us the names, but I'm just curious.
Well, amongst skeptics, no. The truth is that they're a relatively small population, these diehard skeptics, and I don't run into a lot of them in real life. Part of that these days is COVID, right? Because we're just not having a lot of contact with other people. Part of it is just in any particular community where you're meeting people face to face, you're not going to encounter very many of them. And if I do, I might encounter them on a very casual basis, but not enough to get an idea of how their lives are actually going and what they're doing with women. So on a personal level, I don't have enough data on how these people work. But, you can see it in the writing, and you can see it in the general communities of, how much drama they have around the issue of misogyny. And when women, for example, described going to the conferences, to these skeptical conferences, there was a lot of inappropriate touching. They were afraid to get in elevators with people.
Oh, God.
Yeah. And having men constantly come on to them, which is, women in general have that problem.
Well, you don't have to explain it to me personally, but I think for our listeners, especially if they have lived experience, they know what you're talking about, and they know what damage this can inflict, both at a personal level and on your career and frankly your entire life. This is not something to be taken lightly. And even reading about cases such as these, and for our listeners, we are going to include a couple of links in the show notes, but a fair warning, it is quite emotionally heavy. Especially, and I can say from my experience, if you have lived experience of sexism, there's only so much you can go through before you leave absolutely disgusted. And to imagine the firsthand experience of that, the impact on women and frankly anyone who is marginalized in some way, and then at a science level, the impact on what we actually get from scientific research and the people who get to stay in it and advance their careers and give their input in the first place. It's just horrific. Craig, can you expand on that a little bit? Like for me, it got it got very emotional, honestly, reading about all of this.
Well, let me give you the male perspective here, because that's really where I'm more qualified. I'm hardly qualified to talk about the lived experiences of women. But from the male side, it's really hard, even if you're empathetic, to see what's happening. You can hear from women, and you can hear from women, you can understand the issues, but from a male perspective, it's not lived. When I go out, I don't have people catcalling me. I never did, not as a young man or as an older man at all. I don't really worry about people randomly hitting up on me. I never did. And just in general, I don't have that fear of somebody encroaching on my life and trying to control me in some manner. It just doesn't happen. that kind of experience is not there for me. And in order to understand women better and their experiences, I had to stop and listen really hard and try and put everything together, which is something that you have to actively try to do. You have to, from a male perspective, you have to push past the tendency to just sort of block it all out because it's not my thing, it's not my problem, I'm not going to think about it, and actually start listening. And when I did that, then things were a little bit different for me, because then it's like, okay, I hear this all the time from women. I have a chiropractor as a young woman who just stopped taking men because she's a young, pretty woman, and it was just too much trouble for her. They, randomly getting hit up by a guy, having them inappropriately touch her, all this kind of stuff was just too much for her. Mm-hmm. So she just stopped taking in men as clients, which is a shame because she's really good.
It's terrible.
But, I understand her position. I knew a female musician who could pretty much count on having a guy try to hit up on her after she finished every concert. Some guy would come up from the audience and hit on her, and then, of course, she would turn them down, and at which point they would start name calling, right? And you hear these things enough, and then it finally, in the male brain, finally starts to sink in that this is really an issue. But it takes time, and it's difficult to process because it's not an experience that I have.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I just wanted to say that I have the experience of being in the other position where I would have to tell, men in my life, and very egalitarian men in my life, like, look, this thing happened, and you were there, you saw it. It was very subtle. Sometimes it's very subtle, but the impact is very long lasting. And have you, because we are talking about both overt and covert sexism, and I think something that's important to point out is that this is not pointing the finger at men. I think this can come from anyone. I think we all have, being socialized in patriarchal societies, at the end of the day, we do have these sexist attitudes at some level, and we really need to be on the lookout for these biases. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely, yeah. So from a male point of view, this requires some reprogramming. I grew up in an age where women were just starting to really assert themselves through feminist movements. This was, back in the late 60s, mid 70s or stuff, when it really started to blow up. And so I've been exposed to that for a long time. And it's even so, you have these habits which are ingrained in the men around you, which are kind of dismissive of women's issues. It's not that they're trying to, it's that they don't hear them. The guys just aren't hearing, they aren't seeing the issues that women have, because they don't have a relatable experience that's similar to that.
I want to expand on that a little bit with you, because I think it's really important. Well, I want to start, actually, this is where I want to start from. We talk about sexism in these pseudo-skeptical communities, militant skepticism types, this very niche. And this is something that I remember asking you, is sexism something you also see in parapsychology circles? What do you think, what do you see happening there?
I've kind of looked for it in parapsychology, but I haven't seen any writing or any protests from women complaining about issues of sexism and parapsychology. So it's if it's there, it's largely invisible, and I don't think it's a problem based upon what I've been able to see. The current president of the Parapsychological Association is a woman. The executive director is a woman. The president of the Society for Scientific Exploration is a woman. I believe that her next in command is a woman. So you have women in positions of power in these organizations. And one of the things about parapsychology is this is not a field that you get into if you're a shrinking violet, afraid of criticism and not willing to mix it up with people, because you have to be pretty headstrong to get into this field. And I have a hard time believing that if these women were encountering a lot of sexism there, that they wouldn't speak up. I think we'd be hearing about it because although they're very nice, decent, welcoming people, I'm fairly certain there's a spine of steel back there, because they're in parapsychology and you kind of need that to be there. So based upon the fact that I think parapsychology has a lot of very strong women in it, and the fact that I think that they would speak up if there was just a general problem, maybe not for an individual doing something one time, but if there was a general problem with sexism, I think we'd be hearing about it, because I think they'd be pretty loud in their objections. I'm speculating here, but these are my conclusions based upon what I know of the field. There does not seem to be a systematic problem of sexism in parapsychology, as far as I can see.
Well, I'm very happy to hear that, and I sure hope that's not the case. I do want to challenge that a little bit, not in the sense of bringing up overt sexism, but this is something that comes from my own lived experience, because as you say, this is something that you see from your perspective. And I think it's okay. Well, most of us can't see overt sexism when it happens, these extreme cases especially. But I think many times what happens is we don't see the subtle forms, those things that even as a woman make you wonder, was that okay? I'm not sure, they leave you feeling a little bit iffy. So I did come across a post a while ago, and I only present this not as a criticism to parapsychology in 2022, because it's an example from 1991. It has been a long time since then. But it is the only thing that I encountered so far that resemble that subtle flavor of sexism. And I think even if it's not the case today, which I hope it's not, I think it's such a good example of how it can crop up even in very egalitarian communities. And that example is from an article on the Women and Parapsychology Conference that took place back in 1991. And the article is co-authored by Nancy Zingrone and Lizette Coley. And what they're talking about is, and I quote from both of them. So for the first one is from Nancy Zingrone. In 1991, very few of the men in the field took the Women and Parapsychology Conference seriously. So many otherwise egalitarian male colleagues in the field dismissed the topic as a women's thing that I was a bit demoralized about the situation. And then Lizette Coley follows, we seemed to have peaked too early for many who airily dismissed the fruits of an excellent conference as just that woman thing. And this sounds so familiar to me from similar experiences that I've had. And I want to underscore again, this is not a criticism of parapsychology in 2022, because I don't know if something like that would happen anymore. And in fact, there is a Women in Parapsychology Revisited conference that will take place this year on November the 19th. And I will drop a link in the comments for everyone interested. It's organized by the Parapsychological Association. But this is the type of subtle form of sexism that I want to bring up, because I think it affects so much. It affects, not just the lives of women involved in the first place. And then, if you look at it from the scientific output perspective, what scientific output you even end up happening, what scientific output, researchers and the general public are even aware of. And at the end of the day, what progress we even end up making, right, in this field that is already devoid of resources that it so desperately needs. Craig, what are your thoughts here?
From my perspective, that's a little bit tough, a little bit of a tough call. And the reason is because in entertainment, there are people who are targeted audiences and non-targeted audiences. And so when you have a conference that says it's for women, the men automatically do not consider themselves the targeted audience.
Mm.
So the question, and this is something that I obviously can't completely answer, you'd have to get in everybody's head, is are the men just saying, oh, I'm not the target audience here, I can turn this off? Or are they legitimately dissing, just sort of dismissing women? And that is that's one that I can't answer definitively, because there is this effect of I'm not the target audience, and so I'm just going to tune this out. So the question would be, if we put the women in a different format, where everybody's sharing together, are women do the women's presentations garner less support than the men's? And I think that's how you would have to measure something like that, whether women overall in a mixed situation are getting less attention than men. And I don't have any data for that. I don't know how that plays out.
Thank you, Greg.
But there is the issue of target audience, which complicates things.
I agree with you in that there are many factors coming in, and I think, and this is what I appreciate about the way you approach things. It is a nuanced approach, so it's a yes and a type of thing, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. I want to come back a little bit to sexism and pseudo-skeptical communities, because when we connected and we had a private chat, we kind of stumbled upon this idea of linear versus holistic thinking, and this is something you also bring up in your book. And I recall you drawing a connection to why sexism might even occur in these communities. Do you want to expand a little bit on that?
So the reason that sexism comes up, I'm fairly certain, is because that these are largely authoritarian personalities in these organizations, and you also find that, for example, in other scientific communities, where you have a lot of authoritarians doing power grabs and looking for positions of power and pushing their point of view, and they tend to be fairly successful at that because they're constantly self-promoting. And these types of people tend towards sexism because that fits in with their mentality. They consider women to be beneath them in a way, and so they tend to treat women as somebody they can run over, I guess is one way to describe that. They see women as somebody to manipulate and to control and to lord it over because they can, right? Because they perceive themselves as being in a position of power over them. Mm-hmm. That's authoritarian. And when you see it in science, you see the same sort of problem. The sciences in general have a terrible sexism problem.
That's what I wanted to come to. Yeah. Please tell us more on that, because I think that's very relevant.
Well, I stumbled upon the sexism in science while searching for information on sexism in skeptics, of which there's actually very little, other than the dramas themselves that unfolded over the years. But sexism in science is a really interesting topic, and the people who are the big litmus test for this are trans people who have transitioned from male to female or from female to male, because they have experiences in science from both sides, and the change is quite dramatic for them, because on one end, as a woman, they're getting no respect at all. And then as a man, everything changes and suddenly they're respected in their field. Same person, same intellect, but completely different perception solely based upon their gender. And it's really an absurdly huge difference. Something that shouldn't be there. And really, I think the only cure for that is simply to flood the science fields with women. Because you're just not going to get that good treatment from men, because they're authoritarians gravitate towards power. So they're going to push for positions of full professorships, for being in charge of the departments and being in charge of various areas where they start gatekeeping. And because they're big on gatekeeping. You see this, for example, with skeptics on Wikipedia. They're gatekeeping all these holistic topics and preventing information that doesn't agree with them. And you see this in the sciences, where they're gatekeeping all these holistic topics and preventing them from getting into the mainstream. And they gatekeep women just as easily. It's basically, these are frightened people and women threaten them, and here we go.
I have a hypothesis here. I'm curious to get your thoughts on, because if in this pseudo-skeptical communities you are describing, there is this attachment to being rational, to being scientific. There is this scientism going on. Well, if we're being perfectly honest, the history of science is stained with sexism. We, as you say, like, women have been pushed out. Women have had contributions that were not acknowledged, or even downright stolen. And this has. And I think it is important for us to acknowledge that the way in which the scientific establishment has come to be has been shaped by that. It is impossible for, rampant systematic sexism, for, me being born at the wrong time, not even being allowed to study physics or having to get some sort of special permission to do that. That definitely shaped the way we do science today. And I would argue that it's somewhat very biased to whatever the people who did get to do science did it, overwhelmingly men across history. Not that I'm making men a homogenous group, but I'm talking more about perhaps a male type of thinking that, we're kind of trying to put everyone into the same shape today. And maybe we don't need to do that. Maybe we need to switch the systems up a bit. Maybe we need to rethink science, which, fields like parapsychology do, and push for serious change. So I kind of see things interlocking here, but I'm curious, from your lens, how does that look like? Do you think this makes sense?
Oh, I absolutely agree that it's all interlocking. You could just see how this plays out. So it starts with, let's say you have a man and a woman on a successful scientific endeavor. And then through sexism, when they publish, the man gets the credit. The sexist scientific body sees the man as naturally as the lead. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't, but that's how they see him. So the woman gets relegated right from the start. As this scientific discovery becomes known, the man's name gets out there, and then the woman's doesn't. And you have this play out over all these fields and all this time. And pretty soon it looks like the women aren't contributing anything, because their names aren't getting out there, because the sexism, little bits at a time, are slowly building this perception that the women aren't contributing to as much, which helps fuel the whole cycle when you go back around again for the next one, that they believe that the men are doing the work, because when they see all the textbooks and all the original studies, all the men are showing up and the women aren't. And so it perpetuates this idea of sexism. So absolutely.
And there's, I have a very specific example of that I came across recently. I'll put a link for the listeners in the show notes. Albert Einstein's first wife, they worked together quite a lot. Like they a lot of the work was co-created, but she wasn't credited for that. And granted, it does seem like she was the personality who didn't want to be in the spotlight anyway, and there were other things at play there as well. But it is her work, and it's not Mileva's name that we're hearing today, right? We're just hearing Albert Einstein's name, but we should hear Mileva Einstein and Albert Einstein, who did co-create a lot of the work. And when I shared that to my social media, I did get messages from people who were absolutely shocked. They were like, I never heard of this. And it's just all these untold stories that we're not aware of that shape where we are today.
Yeah, and then you have stuff like the backlash of critical race theory and all this sort of thing, where people are trying to correct this history and bring minorities in. If you're bringing in minorities to the forefront, you're also bringing women. These two things tend to come together. But when you start pushing for the real history, where all these people suddenly get acknowledged for all their contributions, you get this huge sexist, misogynist, racist backlash. Where they're literally trying to keep that, a revised history, I shouldn't say revised, corrected history away. They don't, it's like, I don't want to see it. I don't want to hear it. Boy, isn't that a view into that mindset? Jeez.
So, going into the practicals, because I think, a lot of people might listen to this and they might say, well, I do want to stand up. I do want to tackle sexism. I do want to tackle discrimination in science. Maybe it's about gender. Maybe it's about race. Maybe it's about something else. But what can we do that can actually practically help? And in particular, what do you think academics can do?
So from my standpoint, I think men need to speak up about when they see sexism. They need to educate themselves on it and be aware of it and speak up when they see it happen. And that this has to be a man-to-man conversation. Because when guys are tuning out women, and I think there have been studies where they've shown where men just simply don't listen to women, like in a meeting, and then a guy will, a woman will make a suggestion, and then a man will make it after her, and the guys hear the men but not the women, that kind of thing. So a man needs to call that out and say, hey, that was her idea. You just stole it. You just stole it. And everybody has to stop and suddenly be aware that, yeah, this person just spoke. This woman needs to be heard. And I think that has to be a guy-to-guy conversation, because just because the men aren't listening to the women. So they need to be talked to by guys who say, hey, look, you're doing this wrong. You need to pay attention to this person. And then that hopefully raises the awareness of the men who are subconsciously dismissing women. Because I think most of the time they're not even aware of it. I rarely see misogyny of any form, but usually it's just the guy's like, this is just the way things are. I'm not misogynistic, and then they go and do something misogynistic, because they don't see themselves the way, they don't see the behavior, and only when somebody calls them out can they recognize that that's what's going on. So that something in their brain can click and go, oh. So that's my particular theory. I think that's a conversation that men need to have with each other in order for that to really make any progress. Men who are being misogynistic need to be confronted by other men. That's my take on it.
Is there something academics can do in particular?
Basically, the same sort of thing. I think in academia, it's probably even a bigger issue. There was the issue of Marie Curie and her husband and the Nobel Prize, where he refused to accept it unless she was included. And that's the reason she's famous, is her husband stood up for her. That's the reason we know who she is, because her husband refused to let a situation perpetuate where he was the sole discoverer. And again, men need to man up, be strong, and give women the credit they certainly deserve.
I fully agree. And there's something I want to add to this, because I think we also have to bear in mind, we are always told to show up authentically, but what we usually fail to mention or even be aware of is that, when you are in a group of people who are like you're not the minority or the majority, you have more leeway to be authentic, which includes speaking up, which includes pointing out when something's wrong. But if you are in the minority, you do risk backlash. In the case of women, we can be told, we're too angry, or, whatever else type of backlash we might incur. So I think this is another reason why it's important in this case for men to step up. And in general, whenever you find yourself being in the majority and having that protection, let's say, that you can actually, you should step up and speak. And I completely agree with you here. The other thing I wanted to bring up was, because we talk about solutions at an individual level, but that doesn't always feel complete to me. I feel we should also talk about solutions at a systems level. Because one example being, if we have the history of science, stained by sexism, and it was shaped in that way, then perhaps some of the current structures are not working for women, and we should be explicit about that. And I feel we're kind of hiding away from that sometimes. What do you think, Craig?
That's a really tough one. I mean, first of all, I agree that this needs to be systematic. On the other hand, how you accomplish this is a really tough one, because there's no system that can't be manipulated. When you get the wrong people in charge, things can be interpreted in a different way. Some rules can be ignored, some can be overemphasized, and pretty soon people have things just the way they like them, which is they don't have to change. So it's really, really tough at the system level, because this is really about people and their own awareness rather than a systemic thing. If I was going to, if somebody gave me the budget and the time and the sciences and said, stamp out misogyny in sciences, Craig, I would make sure that misogyny awareness was a required course every year for every man. That they have to sit through a year, they have to sit through at least a semester of education about misogyny, where they have to keep hearing the stories of the women's experience, so that it slowly starts to sink in. Beyond that, I don't, you're teaching empathy, which is a really, really tough thing to do. You have to figure, the people that are most misogynistic probably had mothers that were screaming at them all the time. Parents that are angry and yelling at them. I mean, they're angry people, right? That's part of the makeup, particularly when you're looking at, these hardcore skeptics, hardcore religious zealots. They're angry people. So that can only mean that they had angry childhoods, and they probably had parents screaming at them, and they just sort of tune it all out. And so when women get angry at them, they flip into this automatic defensive gesture that they learned from childhood of tuning it out. So getting angry doesn't really help because they've been there, they've done that, they know what to do psychologically to protect themselves from somebody else's anger. They just shut them off. They get angry back. You end up with this delicate path of you have to not trigger that when you're confronting misogyny, which is why a guy to guy thing tends to help, is because they're less likely to get triggered by that. Once you trigger people, you've lost their rational thought. They're caught up in their emotions and they're not going to hear anything. So you have to approach people when you're dealing with a topic like this in a way that doesn't trigger their automatic emotional defenses, so that they can actually listen. And that's a tough one. You're getting into the field of psychology and trained clinicians to pull off something like that. And it could be a lot to ask of a regular person.
That's a very good point, because it is an emotional topic on all sides, well, for different reasons, but and we all get into this very defensive state when we talk about it. So that's very true, that we do need to be very careful how we approach things so that we don't trigger that, so that we can have an empathetic discussion, a rational discussion at both levels. And I agree with you that empathy is key. And I'm not quite sure how to go about teaching that either. I mean, I think it's a longer term effort type of thing. Comes from family, comes from formal education, comes from a lot of places where you could foster empathy. I would say that the type of course that you're describing, I mean, I would have everyone in it, because at the end of the day, you're talking about intersectional feminism. It sounds like. So I think, we all have unconscious biases. We all need to sit down and confront them and learn how to be with the uncomfortable feelings, because we all like to believe we're the good people. I wanted to say the good guys, but, then I caught myself. So, and we don't see where we slip, where we mess up. Well, we do. We discriminate, we do make these snap judgments, that are not in favor of other people, and we do exclude people without realizing, but we only see it when it happens to us. And thus the blind spot. So when it comes to this history of sexism in the sciences, and how it might contribute to the exclusion of fields such as parapsychology, or really anything that tries to tackle holistic thinking type of approaches to how we live, how we conceptualize of our reality, and so on, I came across this quote allegedly by Wilhelm T. Preyer, and he attacked the Society for Psychical Research in its beginnings. And basically what he said was that a strict scientific spirit cannot be considered the motto of the society in the first place is already evident from the large numbers of female members and participants. So you can kind of see how this idea of what is scientific and men was so entangled at the time, at least in the minds of some scientists and presumably members of the general population, that I think we really cannot ignore its consequences in the present day. Like, what does that say to you? Like this type of statement?
Well, back then, of course, they were allowed by society to say such outrageous stuff. The weaker sex sort of deal, which allows us to see explicitly what was going on in their minds, because they felt free to say exactly what they were thinking. Now they aren't free to say something like that because they would receive a lot of backlash, but that doesn't mean they aren't thinking it. So my take on that is the more things change, the more they stay the same. this whole area of parapsychology, the occult, and women, they've always been very much tied together. And I think one of the issues here is that when it comes to intuition and psychic ability, the people who can do this best are about two-thirds female, one-third male. So it is substantially a female ability in many ways. And this is also an area where women can exert great power. There's a great deal of power in psychic ability, obviously. And when you're looking at people who can see, who are intuiting things, who are seeing a little bit of the future, who are able to navigate psychically issues that can't be dealt with rationally, you're talking about people with a very particular type of power. Real raw power, and that is incredibly threatening to authoritarian types, because it's not a power they can take, it's not a power they can use, it's not a power they can manipulate. It belongs to a person, and it only comes through them. And if it's a woman, obviously you see, the whole witchcraft thing and whatnot that the churches did, which is really no different from scientists disparaging women now. It's just one was overt and the other one was subversive. It's attacking people who have this certain type of power. And those people are women, and so it frightens them.
So then what I'm hearing is that this holistic, this intuitive type psychic, ability was associated with women, and then these two kind of got rejected together. Is that what you're saying?
Well, if this was primarily a male ability, I don't think they would view it the same. In other words, if authoritarians had this sort of intuition, they wouldn't be frightened by it. But it's an unknown for them. It scares them because, for example, I've frightened them sometimes when I've been talking to skeptics by intuitively understanding them. They don't like that at all. They don't like to be seen. They like to think of themselves as being completely in control. And when somebody else can see them clearly, they don't feel in control. And of course, highly intuitive women can do that. It's just, this holistic thing is tied to women. And this is one of the reasons you see all these holistic topics get attacked so fiercely, is that they're tied to women. That women are good at this. And so they're going to attack the subjects that the women are good at.
And when you say that when it comes to psychic abilities, about 2/3 of the people who are good at it are women, is this anecdotal type of evidence, or is there actual hard data behind it?
I don't have the exact studies in front of me, but this is something that's generally known in parapsychology.
So, Craig, if we imagine that, we go in 50 years from now, and just based on how things are looking at the moment, how do you think that in 50 years from now, things will look like? Do you think we'll manage to do away with dogma and discrimination in science by then?
No, I think
that's depressing.
I think we can diminish it, but eliminating entirely is probably not in the cards. And my reasoning for this is that there seems to be personality traits that are sort of baked into people in consciousness in general, that you're always going to have a certain percentage of true believer types in society. That there's usually the number seems to hover around 25%.
What do you mean by true believers?
Oh, true believers. These would be the super zealot skeptics, the fundamentalist Christians and pretty much this authoritarian type of personality, they're always with us. And they will always seek power, and there's always a struggle to try and keep that from them because it's something they want, sometimes for jobs that nobody else wants. And they immediately start in with their gatekeeping and stuff, and all the misogyny can start, because when they're in charge, they bring other people in like them. And then you end up with a culture that serves them. You see this in a lot of police departments where they have trouble with all kinds of issues, ranging from sexism to racism and all this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And it's just, you get these authoritarian types in charge. They bring in other authoritarian types, and pretty soon the whole place has that sort of culture because it gets toxic for everybody else. And they start leaving, which brings in more of the other type. And this plays out in the sciences, it plays out in police departments, and pretty much any place where you're going to find a lot of power. That you're going to find these people with authoritarian personality types will be attracted to the positions of power, and they'll start bringing in other people like them. It gets toxic for other people, and pretty soon you have this problem of sexism in perpetuity.
Isn't that an artifact, though, of how we choose to organize ourselves and how we even conceptualize of power, you think?
Well, personally, I think it gets back to upbringing. You need to start with the good base, children who are loved and supported. And if you start from that base, then you have fewer kids who turn into authoritarians. You still have them, even with the best environments, but you have fewer of them. In other words, the parents aren't creating them. So it needs to start in the home and work its way out from there. And of course, that gets a lot harder because you're talking, instead of maybe thousands of institutions, you're talking millions upon millions, hundreds of millions of families, which is it's a much harder problem.
One thing that you mentioned in your book, and I think this is important because when we approach these topics, it's very good not to paint everyone with the same brush, see people as people, and to have nuanced discussions, that there are indeed people in the skeptical community you describe, men that did stand up for their women colleagues and actually have put their career on the line for them. So, it's not that as black and white as, skeptics hate women or anything like that. Would you like to share a bit more about that with us?
Yeah, I did run into a few skeptics who were simultaneously very, very militant in their attitude towards psychic ability, but on the other hand, would very vigorously defend women in the face of misogyny, and it wasn't a lot of them. I could count them all on the ones that I encountered all on one hand, but they are there, and and when you in some of these situations of misogyny, for example, when there was one case with journalist Ben Radford, his skeptic girlfriend, and got accused of all sorts of misogynistic behavior from her. Well, she was his girlfriend, which kind of changes things a little bit, and to the point where he had a lawsuit, and she dropped all these claims as a result of that. In relationships, things are more complicated, and you can't just take things at face value.
Well, I would push against that because rape in relationships is still a thing, and I think it is dangerous to imply otherwise. I'm sure that that's not the implication there, but I think it's important for our listeners to clarify that rape can happen in any sort of context, relationship or not. What I hear that you're saying is that the particularities of that case might have been seen differently through that lens of them already being in a relationship. Is that correct?
Well, but my only point here, of course, first of all, yes, rape can happen in a consensual, in a regular relationship. You can have misogynistic behavior and all this sort of thing. Wife beating is totally a thing. So I don't want to take that part away. But when you have accusations flying back and forth from a relationship, you have to take a step back and wait for more information. The things aren't always as they appear. Particularly if you're only hearing from one party, and you need to like take a step back and not be super judgy right away because you don't know the whole story. Obviously, if the more evidence you get, the more you can draw conclusions. But usually that's not the case. You just hear from one person.
We do need to see people as people, and I think that's what you're getting to hearing all the evidence, and we're kind of circling back to how we started this discussion about pseudo skeptics not even being willing to look at the evidence and having one view in their mind that they seek to maintain, and just to respect our listeners who might need a resource on these topics, I will include a link for victims of sexual assault for anyone looking for support, or for anyone who knows someone who might need support in that. Craig, what are spirituality and God to you?
I don't really have a specific belief in God myself. I tend to view consciousness as fundamental to physics, and my own personal beliefs are based upon what I see in parapsychology, which is that we have a universe where we are active participants and we have the ability to nudge reality to a certain extent in directions that we choose, and that our own thoughts are incredibly important, and how we use those thoughts has a direct influence on how things play out for us.
And do you have any belief in God per se, or does God not really play into this view of the world?
Well, it kind of depends on how you define God. If we're talking about a personal God that you can talk to, no, I don't really buy into that. If we're talking about a collective consciousness of all of reality that has a mind of some sort that is completely beyond our comprehension, yeah, I'm totally down with that. But the idea of a God, particularly one selecting groups of people as worthy or something like that, no.
And if you could be remembered for one thing, what would that be?
So my wish list is that that in my lifetime I can help move the needle towards acceptance of parapsychology. I think there's something really, really important there in that science, and moving towards acceptance of that also, I think, means that there are social issues, including how we treat women, that are involved in that acceptance. There are a host of things, because we have to think differently about reality in order to accept parapsychology, and that will include thinking about women a little bit differently. Certainly, when we're talking about topics like reincarnation, we've all been women and we've all been men. So gender really isn't as cut and dried as we think it is. That women are going to have male aspects and men are going to have female aspects, and it's we're dealing something particularly at an energetic soul level of something that's more of a spectrum rather than a physical body. And that's another thing with parapsychology is the physical isn't primary. You can't really have psychic ability and have the physical be primary. The mind itself has to be primary. Consciousness itself has to be fundamental for all of this to work. And if you're focused on the mind, then the body is a less important aspect of it, and you start pay more attention to the person and not their physical form. So I think it's important for those reasons as well.
I think you have such an important goal, and the points that you raise about parapsychology and how it shapes how we think about ourselves, how we see other people, it's really important. Like, now that you say it, I'm realizing it could also help loosen our over attachment to our identities.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something you would also agree with? And maybe in the long run, we would get less of that contrarian attitude, without looking at the evidence type of thing, maybe we get more open-mindedness in the long run.
Well, I certainly hope so. As you can tell, I'm fairly open-minded myself, and I don't really do close-minded well. I don't deal well with that sort of person. In my business, in fact, that's something I look out for, because narrow-minded people will cheat you. That's just, that's life in the self-employed lane. So it behooves me to pay real close attention to that particular trait.
in a very practical sense.
In a very practical sense, yeah. And it all ties together.
It does. It really all does, and it's something that I notice in my life as well. It's interesting once you go down exploring fields such as parapsychology, how things in your life seem to shift sometimes as well. Do you also have that experience?
Yeah, the interesting thing with parapsychology is I realized when I started being able to converse with people on a regular basis that I'd found my crowd. That these were my people. These were the ones that I could relate best to. It was a really wonderful moment for me. This whole COVID situation has been a godsend to me because of, particularly in a field like parapsychology, they were having these conferences all over the world to try to accommodate everybody. And it'd be thousands of dollars to attend something like that, which I couldn't afford. Well, with COVID, everything went online. And all of a sudden, I can connect with people all over the world over a conference to share this interest with me, and it's been wonderful.
Well, that's how we connected as well. We're pretty far apart.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome. I agree. And Craig, if our listeners remember just one thing from what you shared today, what should that one thing be?
The one thing I would say that listeners should do is pay attention to the idea of authoritarian personalities. Learn to recognize them, learn to see authoritarian traits in people, because once you begin to recognize that, when people are being very narrow, that you'll know more about how to deal with them, because they'll be 99% of your trouble if they're in your life. And, there's knowing that this type of personality is somebody that you're having to deal with helps a lot in being able to deal with them, because they're very difficult to fight with.
And Craig, for everyone who wants to learn more about you and your work, where can our listeners find you?
Well, I am the science editor for Paranormal Daily News. So if you go to their website, you will find my articles there on parapsychology. And I'm also active on Twitter under the name Craig Weiler. And so it's fairly easy to find there. And I'm also on Quora occasionally. I can be reached on that particular website as well. I have a parapsychology site there with 20,000 followers. And then I have my own account there as well. So excellent. There are ways to read what I've written.
Excellent. We'll put all those links in the show notes. And with that, Craig, I want to thank you so much for sharing your time, your wisdom, your knowledge, your insights, and for having this discussion with me today, which, I appreciate that it's not always easy to have, but it's so important. And I really appreciate you being today and sharing this space and your insights with us.
Thank you. It is a difficult topic. So, sexism is tough. Even talking about it, it doesn't feel good to talk about, bad experiences for women. I have an instant empathetic response, and it makes me uncomfortable thinking that, people around me are not living their best life sometimes because they're having to watch out for very, very disagreeable men who are looking for any way to gain an advantage over them in some way. It's difficult, it's uncomfortable, and it's just a tough topic.
It really is. Thank you so much. And to all our listeners, I highly recommend you follow Craig. You will learn a ton about parapsychology, which is a very fascinating field, as you might be able to tell if you have never heard of it. Craig, thank you so much again, and I'm looking forward to connect again.
Thank you very much for having me, Christina. It's been a great pleasure.
Likewise,
Thanks.
Craig.